Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, touring my shop. So I've had requests for years for doing a shop tour here in the shop. Now, I recently moved into, I moved into this shop about 2.5 years ago. And before that, I was in, for almost 20 odd years, I was in a 2-car garage. So I'm incredibly grateful to have been able to move to a new shop like this. So a lot of lessons that I learned in having to use that really restricted space for a long time, and some of those were very helpful to me when I moved to this much larger space. So stick around to the end. I'm gonna, at the end, kind of draw some lessons from my own experience in working in a really restricted, crummy kind of space, and some of the lessons that I drew as I moved to a larger space. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this area right here is basically my woodworking area. So I've got a jointer. I got that when I moved in here. I've got a wood lathe, bandsaw, table saw, planer, and a chop saw, radial arm saw, whatever you want to call it. So in my previous shop, I really had no space for something like this. You know, I like doing some woodworking just as a hobby thing, but also as a knife maker, it's nice to be able to cut wood and shape wood for knife handles and, you know, basically for all kinds of purposes, scabbards, whatever it might be. And so it's really handy having this area here, having plenty of space. I've still got room to expand a little bit here. So this shop is 2,400 square feet in total, and 60 by 40, and you know, 16-foot ceiling. What I was in before was a 2-car garage, wooden. I was doing all kinds of things involving fire and sparks and all that, and doing that inside a wooden structure as opposed to this metal structure was always a little nerve-wracking. So very happy to be in a place that really can support fire-related work without a lot of nervousness. So here's my forging area. Got the anvil, my old original forge. I've got some other forges here, but this one I really like. I made it 25 years ago. It was one of the first things that I ever had, and when I made it, it's an unbelievably ugly, crude piece of equipment. I didn't have welding equipment. I basically made this with a screwdriver and a hand drill. I don't think I even had a drill press at the time. So point is, you can get started in your shop. If you want to start making knives, you can really start at a very low level in terms of expense and equipment. I've got a Riverside machine forge press. This anvil's an old Mankell anvil. I've had this anvil since, you know, for 25 years, since I got started. And it's a beautiful anvil, 130 pounds, does the trick for everything that I need. These days, I really am doing far less in the forge than I used to. When I got started, I was really a hammer and anvil guy, but now I've moved to more production type work, which is gonna lead us over to the next part of the shop here. So this is basically what I guess you would call my machining area. This is my big new addition to shopdom here. In a sense, this was really the justification for the move that I made 2.5, 3 years ago, whenever it was that we moved here. You know, I wanted to do more production work, and I had gotten started doing kind of semi-production, mid-tech, whatever you want to call it, knife making 7, 8 years ago when I bought my Tormach. So that's a CNC machine too, but obviously with much less capability than this Haas Mini Mill 2 right here that I just got last year. I'd been doing Japanese swords for a long time, and obviously that was all happening here in this area in the forge. But there were a lot of reasons that I wanted to get more or less out of the Japanese sword business. Largely because it's not a very good business. I love making Japanese swords. That's probably the thing that I'm most passionate about. Though I have to say, I've gotten pretty passionate about the whole CNC process too, which is extremely interesting. The first machine tool that I ever got, I believe, was my lathe. It's a Grizzly gunsmith lathe. So that was the first thing that I bought. And then I think after that, I got my mill drill over there, which is sort of like a lowbrow version of a Bridgeport or a vertical milling machine. And between those two things, you can do most traditional type machining. You know, those are not cheap machines. It's a big step up when you go from a belt grinder and maybe a forge to buying machine tools. And there's a long learning curve that comes with machining, but I find it super satisfying and interesting. So to me, this is really my future, and this is kind of my past right here, the forging area. But I still do forging. Next couple of days, I plan to be making some Damascus steel. I still make some traditional tools, like I'm making a Japanese marking knife for carpentry out of Damascus steel. So I still really enjoy this part of the work, but this is the bulk of where I spend my time, and the grinder room. Speaking of which, let's head in that direction. Hey, let me jump in quickly and say, if you have been watching this channel for the many years that I've been putting information out there about knife making and knives, and you want to give back to the channel, help us put out more videos, there's a way of doing it, and that is called Patreon. So I always try to help out my Patreon subscribers. If you have questions about knife making, shoot them to me. Always happy to answer them. And if you subscribe to Patreon, you get access to tons and tons of plans. So I've probably done close to 100 builds, and I'm not gonna say that the plans for every single one of those are on Patreon, but a bunch of them are. So help us help you, patreon.com/Walter Sorrells, links in the cards and description. So before we head into the grinder room, I just wanna talk about storage. These are old storage bins or tool bins or whatever you want to call them that I had at my previous shop, and so I brought them here. If you're thinking about moving to a new shop or building a shop or whatever, think a lot about storage. The more tools you have, the more material you have, the more that you have to think about how to store it efficiently. If you look over at my workspace here, there's just crap lying all over the place. That's just kind of who I am. That's the way I work. But the more you can efficiently organize everything so that you don't have to have all your crap lying around and you know where everything is and all that sort of thing, it's important to be able to do that. I bought, when I moved in here, I don't know, like 8 of these shelves from Uline. They're very sturdy shelves, very handy to have, but they cost a fair amount of money. So when you're thinking about upgrading your shop, just be aware that those kind of things can nickel and dime you to death. So one thing worth mentioning before we go any further, I kind of inherited this compressor here from the previous owner. And what I immediately did once I moved in here was put in an air system. My buddy Dan Moynihan helped me set up this whole air system. And in the grand scheme of things, the air is not, the system was not super expensive. I spent a few $100 on it, and it was worth every penny. So now I've got air in my grinder room, I got air for my machine tools, air over by the grinders, air basically everywhere. And it is really, really, really handy, and probably one of the best investments I made when I moved in here was getting this air system put in. So this lovely space here is my grinder room, or I call it the dirty room. The most important thing that I have in here are my belt grinders. I've got 3 of them in here. I've got a V-Vor, I've got my original Bader B3, and then I've got an Ameribraid here. So this room right here, to me, is one of the 2 main justifications for moving into this new space. First was giving me space for a grown-up CNC machine, but the other thing was just being able to isolate all the dirt and dust and crud that grinders produce from everything else in the shop. In my previous place, you know, I put the belt grinder in there on a workbench. As soon as I bought it, I didn't really think too much about it. I still had a lot of space at the time. And so, you know, no big deal, just throw it in there and it is what it is. But of course, over time, I realized that it would have been nice to isolate it. And the reason for that is just, if you're in a small space and you have a grinder, it just covers everything with crud. Anything that you're trying to do that's sort of clean or finicky, you're just going to get crud on. It's a huge problem. And so that has been, basically solved in this space here. Unbelievably happy with being able to have this space here. In addition to the belt grinders, I've got, a little bench grinder here. I've got a disc grinder. I've got a buffer. I've got some vibratory tumblers. I've got my surface grinder. I've got an abrasive chop saw, and I've got a blast cabinet. And every single one of these things produces dust, abrasive crud in the air, all stuff that you don't want to breathe. So most of the time that I'm in here, I'm going to be wearing a mask. So one of the things that I've wanted to do from the very beginning in here is set up a really good ventilation system, but it's very complicated to do, and it's not going to be cheap, and it's going to take me a lot of time. So the bottom line is I have not gotten around to that, and so most of the time when I'm in here, I'm wearing a mask, and that's just the way it is. But good news, I get to contain all the crud in this one space. So this area right here is really kind of my primary work area, other than the grinder and some of this machining area. I built this workbench right after I moved in here, and like most things involved in moving into the new shop, it really, it was a lot of work making this thing, but it was a lot of fun to do, and I have to say, completely rewarded all that effort. This workbench has been just really one of the handiest things that I've ever made. Basically, it's got one piece that I fabricated 100% myself, and then the top over there, I got at Home Depot or someplace, and then the bottom of it I made myself. The key point about this whole thing is that I gave a lot of thought to how I wanted to organize my workspace. I had been working before in an area, and for 25 years, almost 20 years almost, I'd been working in an area that I'd inherited that was really made for parking, it was a garage. It was made for parking a car in. And so this was an opportunity to really organize exactly how I wanted to do things. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but it's nice to be able to sort of think through the kinds of tasks that you want to do and how you can organize your workspace. So if you're thinking about building a new shop or altering the shop that you are using, or maybe moving to a new location with a larger shop, or whatever it might be, it's really worth thinking through, especially if you've been making knives for a while. Think through the things that frustrated you the most and try and come up with solutions. And that was my MO for this whole thing, was just to think about how I can work the most efficiently. All right, so I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to give you a few lessons or tips or whatever if you're thinking about expanding your shop, buying a shop, maybe if you are just getting started as a knife maker and want to get your shop organized. So here are some things that I've learned from going from a very small, very poorly equipped shop to really what seems pretty much like a palace for knife makers here to me. So the first tip or the first lesson or whatever is making knives is a marathon, not a sprint. And when you see all these tools and all this stuff and all this space, that's great, but bear in mind that it took me 25 years to get here. When I started out, like I said, I was in a two-car garage. It was very small, very cramped, and it sucked. But I put up with it for a very, very long time because it just costs a lot more to have a place like this. All these tools cost money. There are people who would give you the impression that making knives is a way to accumulate a giant pile of money. This is very much not true. Every single tool in this place was hard won. You know, I had to budget and scrimp and save and sometimes borrow money, and so it didn't happen overnight and it didn't happen easily. Okay, lesson number 2, or point number 2, think about organization. I am not an organized guy. I did not clean this place up. You know, I wanted you to sort of see what it's like when I'm actually using it, not some prettified version of it where, you know, I go around and clean everything up. I got crap all over the place, you know, things stored all over the place. The reality is there's just a lot of material that you're going to use in knife making, and if you want to be efficient and not just spend all your time cleaning, which to me is a giant waste of time, then you have to be organized. So if you're buying a new place, building a new place, or even just getting started, think about storage. Think about putting away your tools in an orderly sort of way. Think about where your materials are going to go. And if you're thinking about how much it's going to cost to do all this stuff, just recognize buying tool chests, buying decent shop shelves, buying you know, storage chests and stuff like that. It's something you got to factor in. Okay, another issue is heat and air. So I worked for 20 years over in my garage. Zero heat, zero air. I mean, I had little space heaters and kerosene heaters and stuff like that, but no air conditioning. Let me tell you, working around a forge in July in Georgia is brutal, and there's no way around that really. So that's just something you put up with in the summer, and if you're in South Texas or someplace like that, it's only going to be worse. However, you know, if you do have separate rooms that you can put some air conditioning in, it's nice to have a little bit of a refuge. My grinder room, little wall unit that was in there, air conditioning unit that was in here when I moved in, it's pretty crappy air conditioner, but just knowing that I can work out here and be sweating my brains out and just go back into the grinder room for 10 minutes and, you know, have the air conditioning on in there and knock the temperature down to 80 instead of, you know, 103 where it's going to be here in July is really nice. So if you got the budget, it's nice to be able to insulate a shop. It's nice to be able to have some heat. It's nice to have some air. You know, if I were heating and air conditioning this entire place, it'd probably cost me 20 grand a year. I don't have 20 grand a year just to make myself a little more comfortable. So the reality is I'm sweating a lot in the summer, and in the winter it is miserable out here. People who have not been to Georgia might think, oh, it's you know, it's warm all. No, it's not warm all year. It'll drop to, I've come in here and it was 17 degrees. So sometimes you work in 17-degree weather. It's just what it is. Okay, so I talked a little bit about this workbench here. The more you think about your workspace, the happier you're going to be. And I'll tell you, the single most important thing that you might want to think about a little bit is your vise. If you have several of them, that's great. In my old shop, I had one vise, this one right here. I've got two of them in here now. But locating your vise is a really important thing, and you want it to be on a really sturdy spot. So just prepare for that vise to be in a sturdy and handy location close to your tools, because there's nothing more annoying than having to run halfway across the shop every single time you want a screwdriver, which frankly is kind of the way it works in here right now. But I did make this workbench to suit me, and so a lot of the tools and things that I use routinely, you know, stuff like electric drills, are sitting here. And one day I think I'll do a video just about this workbench and how organized and all that, but think through your workspace. That'll help you out a lot. Okay, so the final point, and I already made it mainly when we were talking about the grinder area or the dirty areas, the more you can isolate your belt grinder especially, but anything else that produces dust like disc grinders or even some of the woodworking equipment, the more you can get it in a separate room, if you have that opportunity, that's great, and you will be super happy that you did it. But you know, even if you're working in a space like a garage, like I was, I initially put my belt grinder in a place that was very difficult to separate from the rest of the space. If I had it to do over again, I would try and situate that grinder in a place where, if nothing else, I could just hang a tarp or, you know, plastic painter sheeting or something around it, and that would really minimize the amount of dust that got on everything else. And so, you know, the more you can isolate that dirty stuff and dusty stuff from the rest of your shop, the happier you're going to be. All right, guys, thanks for joining me for this tour of my realm here. I am so grateful and happy that I've got the opportunity to have a shop like this. As I said, took me a long time to get here. It was hard won, but super happy to be here, and I appreciate your joining me on the little tour. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.